welcome to all those new participants coming in today, and I'm sure there'll be a few joining us as we go along, just as they return from lunch. The focus of the morning was probably to look at the kind of academic findings of the study and share some of those and hear from papers. We were very keen, and it's been something we've tried to do with the whole project, is try and also then hear from policymakers and practitioners about their understanding of the issues around about festivals, public space and inclusivity. And that's what the focus of the afternoon is. So the first session, which will be from 2 till 3, is focused around about hearing from policymakers and practitioners around about 2 key questions that we've asked everyone to prepare and think about. And then there'll be a second session after 3 o'clock, which is a breakout session where we'll be actually hearing from everyone who's with us at that time in terms of feeding in their own perspectives, and then we'll share those at the end of the event before we close today. So I'm delighted. So I'm David McGilvey, for those that haven't met me yet, the project lead for the Festspace project, and I'm going to be chairing this session, trying to stay out of it as much as possible, because I'm sure there'll be plenty of discussion and flow from the speakers. So the focus is on festivals, public space and inclusivity, and we've got 4 speakers here at the moment, and we asked them to consider 2 questions. So the focus for sort of 5 minutes per person, we asked in the first instance, is firstly, what makes a festival inclusive? A broad question, but to get some perspectives. And secondly, what are the opportunities and challenges involved with staging festivals in public spaces from their perspective? So we've got 4 speakers here at the moment. There may be a fifth who's maybe joining us, so we'll be able to update on that as we go through. I'm not going to go through and introduce every person in detail because their bios are on the websites, and a link to that because I'm aware of time. But we've got Amaranta Wright, who's the founder and managing director of Latino Life, which is the film that some of us saw this morning, and which will be relevant to those that already were here this morning. We've got Philip Eklund, who's a sustainability specialist with Gothenburg & Co., which is the destination management organization for Gothenburg. We've got Julie Pearson, who's head of events at Glasgow Life, so focused on the Glasgow context. And we've got Blythan Quinn, who's the curator of learning at the Irish Architecture Foundation. So the 4 speakers are, as I say, we're going to go in that order. So I'm going to start with Amaranta, who's going to take us away and focusing on those 2 questions with 5 minutes. I'll give you an indication if it's going slightly over. So Amaranta, are you there? Would you like to take us away on your response to those 2 questions?
Hello, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Do you want me to put my camera on or shall I leave it off?
If you can put it on, that would be great.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak, and also, for the lovely documentary you made and inclusion in the report. I have to say, if we relied on recognition, we wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here speaking, but it's really nice to have it, and it's been a labor of love, really, for many, many years. So, thank you very much. So the first question was about what makes our festival inclusive. So, I guess, well, if you've seen the documentary, you probably would have seen my short answer to that. The most obvious thing is that it's free. I don't know how common that is in Europe. It would be good to know, actually, but I know in the UK, in fact, I asked Andrew, I don't know if any of you are Andrew, the chief researcher in the UK, and how many other free festivals, and crucially unfenced festivals, because there are free festivals. I know the Winter Wonderland, but they kind of don't allow you to go in with food, and there's all sorts of ways that they make money out of the public, to compensate for it being free. But for us, this was really crucial, partly because the park that we're in has had, I am actually part of the local community. So, from my own personal experience, I could see how exclusive just, even in a symbolic way, a big wall erected in the park could make you feel, well, for adults, but, I can't imagine what it's like for children to have this huge wall in their park as they walk in. And for some of the commercial festivals in that park, that have been increasing over the years in London and in the UK, because obviously with funding cuts to the local councils, they've been making money out of, hiring the parks out to these big commercial festivals. And yeah, and it just meant that with the rigging and de-rigging, it could be, up to a month in the summer months, not having access to the park. So just the fact that it's free and welcoming of everyone and unfenced, I guess, makes it by nature inclusive. Another thing I touched on was the fact that it's a Latin music event, and Latin culture is a very inclusive culture. I mean, you see it just kind of in the club nights, and you see it at events. You see, a massive array of people that are attracted to that culture. From the Asian community, from Afro-Caribbeans. It seems to be a culture that isn't seen as aggressive. That's it kind of, celebrating life, and people tend to find it quite attractive. So perhaps, if you're you might not be attracted to an event from another community, a Latin community event is often one that people would definitely, associate with being inclusive. The third thing I noted is that from the very beginning in the park, and actually before we're in the park, we were doing the festival outside the park in another smaller venue. Is that, and I don't really know how this happened, but we decided to kind of immerse the community in the weeks leading up to the festival in kind of Latin culture. And we did that by taking performers into schools, like we did assemblies, and doing workshops. Like, we'd send a salsa teacher into a primary school, and they teach the kids to dance, and another teacher and to do drumming workshops in another school. And so that, I think part of the reason we did that is that we realized that a lot of people don't really know anything about Latin music, and part of our whole ethos is really showing the quality and the diversity and the authenticity of Latin music and dance. And so we really wanted to kind of inspire and educate the community around the festival, with the idea that, it would kind of generate more participation and more engagement. So I think that became kind of like our hallmark. And it was a bit it continues to be difficult to fund that element of it. But because as an organization, Latino Life in the Park is only one of the things we do. We work with artists all the year round in other events and festivals. So we have, a very good relationship with artists. So a lot of them, were willing to kind of subsidize the outreach program or do the performance in schools, for not asking us for much money. So we've managed to kind of make that happen. And in fact, this year, we want to kind of reach further into schools that are perhaps more marginalized and do more kind of DJ workshops and things that are kind of going to kind of generate opportunities. And so that's the outreach part of the festival is a very important part of it. Another thing is that the festival manages to be multi-generational. So we have 3 stages. One kind of for big band salsa and jazz, and which I guess the kind of older generation are more attracted to. And as of last year, we had this new kind of urban stage, and that actually kind of brought a whole new demographic. And so I don't think there's that many festivals because kind of bring together the different generations, because basically on that stage it wasn't a family audience at all. It was very much, I would say, even more like the audience that usually the residents of Finsbury Park wouldn't want to be there. But somehow it worked, because again, it was a very good atmosphere. It was Yeah, I mean, it wasn't at all aggressive. But, I think urban music is kind of seen as often as being, a bit more aggressive. But in our case, even though it attracted maybe the urban crowd, it wasn't at all like that. And I think that was really nice because it also enabled the people to see that the reputation that urban music has and isn't actually the correct, reflective of reality. And I think finally, yeah, the programming. I would say that programming, as I said, we really emphasize authenticity because I think, in fact, one of the reasons why we started doing what we do was that we felt that a lot of the Latin events who are kind of that have traditionally been organized by English promoters, usually men, haven't actually reflected the authenticity of our cultures, and this was kind of really important to us. So between Shakira and Buena Vista, we know there's like a huge range of musics and cultures that we try and show off. And a massive element of what we do is, like, we don't bring big international artists. We are starting to do more international collaborations, which is very different, but we don't bring, we're very focused on really giving a platform to kind of UK born, bred Latin musicians, because they're really the ones that have often been sidelined. You get promoters bringing the huge artists, and they don't really do anything for the community at all. They kind of come in and they leave. They don't, there's no engagement with the community. There's definitely no benefits. So, our organization, one of the main things we've been doing, for the last 15 years is really nurturing younger generation. Well, yeah, probably second generation now, Latin artists, kind of children of immigrants who are fusing, the sounds of London with, and bringing their kind of own heritage. And it's kind of a new genre. It's a new that we've been nurturing, and finally, we've been developing it over the years, and finally you have now really, really good quality artists, and they're doing something completely new. And that's kind of one of our big things, and that's why the Candela stage, is so important to us, because it's really showcasing the new generation of UK Latin artists.
Brilliant.
Right, that kind of question.
Can we pause it there then and move on to the next person? We'll come back to these. I know there were other questions. I'm just aware of time to make sure we hear from everyone, and then we can open up more of the discussion. You'll find there's chat as well. So in the meantime, you can contribute back into the chat. I'm going to maybe hand over to Philip next, just for that opening point around about the Gothenburg experience and your sense of what makes festival inclusive, and maybe some of the opportunities of hosting them in public space.
Yeah, so much great stuff is already being said, and I think it's very similar to how we think as well. What you just Amaranta said, and I think I just shook me that inclusive is like one. It's an impossible and huge question to try to answer, but I think the simple answer would be, does everyone feel welcome? And that raise maybe 1,000 more questions. And how do you welcome people, and how do you make a festival where people actually feel welcome? And I think kind of a big question to answer that would be, does everybody have the possibility to attend? And as you just mentioned, money is just one thing that I think is absolutely central in this, because one of many things, but that's definitely one. And I think, being as you just mentioned, we are a DMO, but like to see organizers making public events, I think that almost all the organizers think that they are inclusive, because they say everyone is welcome to our festival. But what does that mean? I don't necessarily think that they are exclusive, but like they are not really inclusive in that way. They are not direct exclusive, but that doesn't really mean that everyone feels welcome. And I think from from our point of view, we are investing as a DMO in a lot of public events in our city. I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, where does this city's money go? To what kind of person does it go? Does it go to equal to all citizens? Is one example of inclusiveness, I think, which is super important. As well, I think important issues to be discussing here would also be, can everyone attend on the premises? For example, you spoke about high fences, but I would also say different stuff, such as, is it possible to attend if you have a wheelchair? That's a super important thing that we are discussing a lot. For example, if it's an arena and if it's in the middle of the city, it can be very hard to actually build the premises so that everyone can take part. And I think another important thing about that would be other disabilities. For example, sight, hearing. Do you use interpreters, for example, to interpret the programming? That's something I think should be more on public festivals, and also public mental issues, such as all people on the autism spectrum, for example, would have problem when it's loud noises, and of course they want to visit festivals as well. And again, I want to come back to the question of money. We asked our visitors once in a cultural festival in Gothenburg, where almost everything was free, and even we saw that even €2 as little as that for an activity could make whole families not coming in because it was just too much for them, and it's hard to understand how it could be that, but it's actually that's how it looks out in the city. So it's very important to see that free festivals are so important. But I would also have to mention the communication, who are represented in the pictures about on the festivals and on the posters, for example, and who are represented on the stages. It's super important, and I think, for example, if you go to a public event, for example, a football game, do you really feel included? For example, if you are a female and you can't really afford the ticket, and it's only pictures of men screaming, do you really feel included? I think that's the question you need to ask yourself. And you mentioned also children's activities. I think that's one of the most important perspective to actually form it as it's for the children. I think that's something we need to be even better in. And geography, again, we are a city, and we know that a lot of people don't really from the outer parts of Gothenburg don't really visit the inner city, which makes it maybe more, if you're only making the festivals in the inner city, it's for a certain area, and that is also another question, just in relation to that. Who did we actually reach with our communication about the festival? Is everyone actually invited? I mean, invited is a broad question, but I think that's something also. And you mentioned content. Is it only men on stage, for example, and who did get the most money from the organizers? I think something super interesting to discuss also. I think turning to the opportunities and the challenges, I think the challenges is definitely that it's a long way to go. I think we are trying to be inclusive, but as I said in the beginning, I don't think we are fully inclusive, and I think there are so many parts of the society that don't really feel that there is anything out there for them, and we need to invite them. I think that's super important, and I think the opportunities is that it's easy to start. I think with small procedures and the structure in this area, and just to speak about it and hand out easy tips, I think much can be done. But I think on the downside, I think there's a long way to go to really become inclusive, and that also raises the question why the event is made. I mean, in our a lot of events from our is private owned event organizers, and of course the reason why they do the event might be the economy, and that's different. I mean, the biggest as we mentioned, one of the biggest barriers would be the money, the fee. So that's a super tough question, and also I think that a lot of private organizers don't really have the money to develop, to work with these kind of questions, because a lot of this means that you need to have a person spending a lot of time in these questions in order to actually master them in a good way. So I think that's also something that's demanding. I think maybe that's probably 5 minutes. I hope that was something interesting.
That's really excellent, Philip. I mean, already with the two contributions to that point, we've covered lots of really interesting issues in terms of that, more opening up the accessibility dimension there, I think, which is something we've not talked too much about in the session so far today, actually, about in the communication, as well as I think Amaranta talking about the kind of the authenticity and working with communities and not simply seeing these as sort of spectacular events where you bring people in all the time. So already really excellent. I'm going to now move on to Julie.
I have one last thing that I forgot to say. I also like how you brand toilets. This is something we work with a lot in Gothenburg. Everyone doesn't identify themselves with either a man or a woman, and if you walk towards the toilets, it's always man or a woman on the sign. So that's something also that's in relation to inclusive for sure. So,
of course, and thanks very much. So I'm gonna move on to Julie Pearson from Glasgow. Julie, would you like to talk next, and then I'll come to Blythe and for the last discussion.
Hi David, hi everyone. Thanks for having me along, and great to hear the comments so far. I suppose from my perspective, coming in from Glasgow, so I wear a number of different hats. So our team are the strategic lead for events in the city. So we manage subvention, we manage the feasibility and bidding for the big events that come into Glasgow, the one-off major events, as well as the delivery and growth of our annual events portfolio and some policy and strategy work. And so when I approach this, it's a kind of holistic, rounded version, which may cover angles that we already have, but maybe a couple of new ones. From Glasgow, if you don't know Glasgow, it's never just about the events. And so events have been a part of the city's transformation over the last 30 years. So we hold what we do and the value that we create through events really close to our heart. So from our perspective, we have built over the years a unique ecosystem for events that helps us connect our events with business and community groups across the city. It's helped us build partnerships and programs and make that connection where an event may be perceived as a large commercial event, but there'll be community connections in there where we can help leverage and facilitate that. So when I look at the first question, for me, an inclusive event, there's three aspects to it: people, program, and place. And so people, so who are we actually trying to target? So I think it's really understanding through the festival, who are we trying to target? Who are the people furthest from engagement? And what's stopping them becoming involved? What are the barriers that helps then inform your communication? And I think that's really important, because even in this digital world, communicating with people is quite difficult. Not everyone has the internet. And so I think it's that broader aspect. And the other thing for me is also about who is in your team, who's in your camp that's driving that inclusivity message. And so even if your team don't necessarily and possibly couldn't represent every audience that you're trying to reach, what is it in your people and your processes that enables you to identify those points of blindness, the opportunities, how you can make your festival more inclusive? And so I think that's really important from a people point of view. The second thing, programming, has already been covered off and different kind of approaches to that. But for me, free programming is good, but a festival doesn't have to be free to be inclusive and accessible. And I think that's really important. And so when you look at some festivals in Glasgow, around the world, they may have their main program, but they've got deliberate interventions and aspects of their programming that will take it out into the community. I spent a few years in Australia, and that's a big thing for the regional community and the outback, and how do they connect with festivals, and so that's a really big part of it. So for me, the programming and also designing it in a way that meets your audience where they are. So they may not fully understand your art form, but how do you simplify it? How do you take it to a place that they will be able to interpret? And the third aspect is place, which I guess is a big part of this conference anyway, but just thinking about how can you, where can you host the festival to make it more inclusive? And it's not, yes, it's about transport, but it's also about associations with particular areas. So some groups may not like a particular part of the city and wouldn't feel comfortable there. So I think whereabout can you host the event that will enable it to be more inclusive? In terms of opportunities and challenges, I suppose the biggest opportunity for me with having events in public spaces is the inclusivity. But I also think as a city and as an event organiser, it's a real chance to embed your event and festival in the story of the city, so in the DNA of the city. So if it's Glasgow, how is your festival really reflecting and embodying all that is great about Glasgow? And so I think that's a really key opportunity, and it's helping communities celebrate their land, their space, their city. So I think that's really important. Another opportunity, again, I mentioned before, is connecting with other programs that are already going on. And so if somebody is organising a festival in a city, it's questions like, who else is talking to the audiences that I want to reach? How can we work together? And that might not be financial support, but there might be some really good collaborations and synergies if you just manage to speak to the right people. In terms of challenges, one of the challenges, of course, if you're an annual event, and I use our city as an example, spaces will always continue to evolve. And so what are the city plans? How does your festival adapt and evolve with that? How do you work with the city? How do you work with the partners to make sure that there isn't an impact, there's a continued evolution? And I think for me, a good example would be Merchant City Festival, an area within Glasgow just now. There's some construction work going on. We have a festival there. So we're now thinking about how do we develop that further to make sure we don't lose the spirit of the festival, but we can continue on. And to me, that also provides an opportunity. So we're talking to the company that is doing the construction and other partners involved in that to see if there are more partnership opportunities. Is there a sponsorship opportunity? Can they access people that we can't access in terms of audience? And so it's just kind of harnessing those opportunities as a city continues to evolve for your particular festival.
Thank you very much, Julia. That's fabulous. Again, another range of new issues and those sort of people, program, and place dimensions. I think really great. Actually, it's sort of things we have been trying to cover this morning, and I think that touches on it perfectly. And I think I really like the idea of the way of embedding festival guests and other things that we do in the city and other plans in the city, including the spaces in the city, which is constantly evolving and thinking about how festivals and events can interact with them. So I'm sure we'll come back to some of these points in the discussion. So I'm just going to move on to the last speaker for just now, which is Blethen, who's, I think, ready for us. And we can, once we've had those, the final kind of contribution, then we'll come back to sort of questions that are already in the chat and points that I've already got. So when you're ready.
Yeah, thank you, David. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lohin Quinn. I'm the Curator of Learning at the Irish Architecture Foundation in Dublin. So thank you very much for the invitation to contribute today to Festspace. So first of all, just a bit about the Irish Architecture Foundation. We're an independent non-profit organisation based in Dublin, and we're dedicated to the promotion of architecture as culture. So we have a huge programme of festivals, exhibitions, talks, screenings, symposia and workshops, and much more. And it's all intended to generate a dialogue and critically engage a diverse public, and also to be inclusive and free. Most of the majority of the events are actually free to the general public. So as we run so many events, I can't speak about everything today, so I'm going to focus in on just one event, which is Open House Dublin, and that happens every year in October. So Open House Dublin is Ireland's largest architecture festival hosted by the IAF. Each year since 2005, we curate about 150 plus free architectural workshops, tours and events across the city. And it celebrates great architecture, urban design and the people who contribute to the creation of Built Dublin. And the Open House Festival is actually part of a huge network of Open House Worldwide Cities. It's a range of 50 organisations worldwide hosting festivals and dialogue about architecture and design. And last year, actually, Open House Worldwide Festival had to go online, just speaking about public space in this context. So the public space became the virtual festival and actually worked out really well in terms of connection and inclusivity. We ran a manifesto as well involving young people and giving them a global platform for their comments and ideas on architecture in a climate crisis. So that actually became more inclusive. But I'm going to obviously just focus on Open House Dublin today. And as background to that, it's really important to mention this in the first place. In 2021, we embarked on an audience engagement strategy in the IAF as a whole, in our organisation as a whole, across all our programmes. And we were looking at inclusion and accessibility. But we were particularly focused on Open House Dublin, where we piloted this strategy in October 2021. And part of this, what we did was we ran focus groups, so pre-event focus groups with people with diverse needs, and got to speak to them and listen to them and what were their particular needs. And then post-event, we had evaluation and feedback from these focus group participants, which was really helpful. And all of this, as I said, was piloted at Open House Dublin, and we want to run it across all of our programmes. So I'm going to speak about that in particular. So as I run through the two questions. So question one, under consideration today, is what makes a festival inclusive? So I have a few points here on that. So making it free, in our case, Open House Dublin and most of our events are free to the general public. So that's very inclusive. It's also multi-generational. It's for all ages. The Open House Dublin is there's an Open House Junior programme for children and young people, and then Open House Dublin, the main event, is for everyone else. Also, it's about exploring and communicating architecture as an art form for everyone. So architecture not as something other or something else, but something that can be understood as a backdrop to everyday life. So all of the events would seek out to do that, to make it very accessible as an art form and to enhance public engagement and understanding with it as an art form. So what we did was, I have a few kind of points listed here, which I'll run through now. So what we advise in future as well for our own work is seek expertise from those with a lived experience. So as I mentioned with the focus group, engage with people who've experienced physical, social, cultural, technological, or other barriers to inclusivity. So when we did this with the focus group, we got a sense of what was needed. And afterwards, we just felt that without that, it would be almost impossible to really know what was needed. That was just so essential. Then when programming, consciously seek to exclude as few communities as possible in being able to equitably experience the festival or event. And only by working with and learning from those we wish to include or engage with, we find solutions and learn how to improve the accessibility and inclusivity of our programme. So in relation to Open House Dublin in 2021, some of the new accommodations we introduced include the following. So we partnered with a company called ERA, and this was to make services available for blind people and people with low vision to support their own booking experience and visits to buildings. We also engaged ISL interpreters over the Open House Weekend events to support in-person tours and events. And part of this was determined by booking forms in advance, so we'd know in advance what was needed. Then on the Open House website, we included accessibility information in the event listing so that anybody who's booking an event or finding out about it know that that's possible. And that would encourage then their feeling of being welcome and wanting to attend. With the website as well, we redeveloped the website generally to meet accessibility criteria, such as color contrasts, screen readers, image descriptions, making it more visual, larger format texts, clearer booking systems. We also redesigned the volunteer forms to encourage diversity and to understand what supports people needed to work with us as volunteers. And we established focus groups, as I mentioned earlier, that was to do with the audience engagement strategy. And we worked with people with diverse needs to support road testing of our accommodations to ensure they were fit for purpose. And as mentioned earlier as well, we did the post-evaluation too, to make sure that everything was in place. And we can always learn from that. We're always learning, and we'll employ that next year then in the next event. And we also provided live captioning at in-person and online events. And then also as part of our films, we commissioned a series of site-specific films about architecture And again, we provided captioning on all of the films as well. So that's addressing really the first question. And the second question then, what are the opportunities and challenges involved in staging events in public spaces? So in terms of challenges, I'm going to look at infrastructure and then event support. So for our festivals, we work within existing spaces, so existing public spaces outdoors and existing buildings then all over the city. So we're working with spaces that already exist, and some of them may or may not have adequate access provisions already. So we have to consider suitable bathroom facilities, adequate or suitable seating. It helps as well to have advanced knowledge of the spaces. So visiting the space in advance, knowing the layout, knowing what's there. Are there steps? Can someone with a wheelchair access the space? Are there ramps? What are the ground surfaces and the lines of sight? So considering all of that with regard to the infrastructure of the spaces. Then secondly, event support. So it's really helpful to establish what supports are needed pre-event. And I mentioned that earlier with the booking forms. But sometimes, obviously, people turn up at an event, so we need to be aware of that as well. We also may need to provide ISL interpretation, captioning, or audio descriptions for events to accommodate as many people as possible. And then the final part is about the opportunities then. So there's opportunities really to both introduce accessibility and accommodations and to establish better arrangements for future events in those spaces. So making spaces more accessible and inclusive on a permanent basis as an outcome of a temporary festival or event. So really ensuring that the audience will then feel more comfortable and confident in attending events and participating overall. So do they feel welcome? The question that came up there in the chat box, and it's been referenced before, does everyone feel welcome? And if not, why not? And what can we do to change this?
That's brilliant, Lethan. Thank you very much. That last point that you made, or just about the last point on the opportunity about using the kind of temporary event to make accessibility and places accessible and inclusive on a permanent basis seems like a really important addition to what we'd heard earlier too, because that is clearly an opportunity to drive forward that message and that agenda. Again, really useful additional points that I think will be picked up in the chat and afterwards. I think I've now been joined by our fifth, actually, and final speaker, Fatima. Are you there, Fatima, from the Govan Hill Festival, which you'll have heard me talking about earlier? Just check that, Fatima. Are you able to speak for a few minutes about the inclusive agenda for that event?
Yes, can you see me? I'm having trouble seeing everyone. Okay, I'm sorry for being late. I couldn't, previous engagement, I couldn't cancel.
We can certainly hear you. I can't see you at the moment, but we can certainly hear you well. So
let's have a look. Is that, there you go. Is that
yes,
better?
there you are. So we've got till 2 or 3 o'clock. So if you could maybe keep it to just over 5 minutes, that'd be great. And then we'll open up for some discussion and questions. And there's obviously some in the chat already. On you go, Fatima.
So in terms of the first question, how do we make our festival inclusive? Well, you probably know that we're a special festival in the sense that we are an anti-racist cultural festival, and we use culture to fight some of the creeping xenophobia that was in our community at one stage, but also to celebrate the history of immigration, particularly where we are in Govan Hill, which is often called the Ellis Island of Scotland. So some of the ways we made our festival inclusive is that we make it very, very clear that this is an inclusive festival. I know it sounds like, you know, sometimes we forget to use these words and actually be stridently forceful in declaring that this is not a festival for the elites or those with money or whatever, that you make it very, very clear that this is for all our community. Some of the ways we deliver that is that we make sure that everything is not just for everybody, that there are certain events for people who want to have their own event, and whether that's in different languages. So we'll have a Roma tent where Roma people will just have their own music and their own, an example is we had a Roma film festival where everything was in Romanesque. You don't speak the language, tough, you know, if you can understand the subtitles, fine, but being inclusive doesn't mean, you know, being everything to everybody. We can't do that, but we need to give room for people who want to do their own thing. So LGBT events are organised by the LGBT bookshop. We don't do them, they do them. So it's also about making sure that our partners feel like they can actually do what they want uncensored by a bigger body, but that they adhere to some of the key themes of the festival. So we do work in partnership, and we think that's really, really important, that Govan Hill Festival is not just me and some of our staff, that it's actually the whole community. So the way we do that is people apply. If we've got money, we're able to give them some money to hold their event, but it has to meet certain criteria. It can't be shit. It's really important to say that quality is so important for a festival. Just because we're a community doesn't mean we'll tolerate anything. You know, we want to strive and aspire to have the best within our community. So they have to meet strong criteria. And you might think that that is against inclusivity, but it's not. It's about us making sure that things can be delivered and delivered properly. I think the previous speaker said beforehand, if we're going to have a Roma Film Festival, we have to have a proper room. You know, we need to identify the space. We need to make sure there's proper sound. We need to give it the you know, the experience that we think people should have, rather than just, you know, shove people in a hall. The other thing that's really important to keep it inclusive is to pay people. And that might mean your festival is small, but it's small. Volunteering does not make a good festival, I'm sorry. It might for the first one or the second one, but people burn out. And people should be respected and paid for. So we make sure all our artists, all of them, and sound people and so on are paid, but also our stewards are paid as much as possible, even if it's a small amount of money. So yeah, umbrella partners taking ownership and responsibility, paying people, and quality for us what makes something really, really inclusive. But to use the languages, not just as an afterthought, or a little thing at the bottom, a footnote to say, you know, we support Black Lives Matter, but it's actually to make sure your programming is reflected, reflects the people you're trying to capture, and your audience. In terms of the challenges of using public space, what public space? All the halls are shut. The council keeps cutting places where we can actually have events. So we've got another battle going on to actually save venues and spaces which are cheap or free and are not privatised. So that's a really big challenge for us. We've lost so much of our old halls and public spaces. Our parks are now being privatised slowly by management companies who are managing what used to be a public free arena. They are now taking responsibility. That's a big challenge for us to make sure we can hold a variety of events in a variety of settings, where occasionally we might need childcare, or occasionally, you know, we need to make sure that's wheelchair accessible. Public parks are one of our biggest things. Streets are one of our biggest things. And occasionally when we got the money and we can afford it, we go down the proper route of getting permission from the council, but often we don't. I'm sorry, often we just, you know, find an avenue which is shut off and have an event there. It's sometimes difficult to have to go through so much paperwork and risk assessments and so on. And sometimes you just have to say, sorry, we're not going to do that. We're having an event. The kids are going to have a karaoke at the end of the street. They're going to set it up. You're going to break the law. You know, I mean, I think they've got bigger things to worry about. But in terms of inclusivity, public spaces like parks are perfect, absolutely perfect, because it's there, big, wide avenues, you know, usually the ground's pretty good. Everyone uses it. So more and more we're looking at outdoor spaces and public places, so everyone can share the experience and we're not confined within, you know, drafty old coal buildings or very expensive buildings. So thanks.
That's great, Fatima. The point you made, a couple of points about kind of, I think we've heard earlier about using the language. You talked about authenticity and following through on the values that you have, and I think that's something that's come through in a few of the people who have spoken. I think that's quite clear in what you do in the Govan Hill Festival. And I guess the challenge of austerity and the way in which local authorities and related partners are operating and feel pressure to operate also has an impact on the kind of inclusivity agenda. Okay, so we are at sort of got about 10 minutes to discuss questions and pull those out. And someone's put one in the chat that I think was really relevant for everyone, but it'd be really interesting to hear your perspective, is on how hybridization of festivals has impacted on inclusion or exclusion agendas. That period we've gone through and maybe still are part of, where we're probably having some online, some offline. Does that have an impact, and what impact does it have? Who would like to go first? You can raise your hand, or you can just take your mic off and speak. Fatima? Oh, sorry, I thought you were going to put your hand up. Is there, yeah, the hybridization, anyone?
What was the word? Hibernization?
Hybridization. You know, the kind of, I guess the in real life and or digital and at the same time. The idea of, obviously we've had to pivot so much to the digital. Does that make a difference to the way that you run your festivals or the agendas of inclusivity around about your festivals and events?
I mean, I can say something.
Jump in, yeah.
I mean, basically, I'm afraid to say that nothing can really replace a live event. I mean, you know, we've all under lockdown had to do different things and, you know, be inventive and do, you know, I mean, we ourselves did that. We did a documentary on the Latin community in London under the pandemic. You know, we did intimate concerts that we also filmed and streamed. But I think really nothing, I mean, sad to say, nothing can really replace and have the impact and the reach that a big, well, in our case, a big park live event has. I mean, in our case, we were very lucky, and weirdly, what was deemed as our weaknesses in terms of getting sponsors and funders and everything, the fact that we only, you know, that we really showcase UK Latin musicians instead of bringing the big international artists, that, and the fact that we were free, so we didn't, you know, have kind of the problems with big insurance costs and, you know, with refunds. So in fact, what had always made things quite difficult for us, in the end made it easier for us to do something very last minute. We really, you know, and we actually managed to put our event on last year, whereas a lot of commercial events, you know, who had to import artists, the big international stars, you know, they couldn't do it. So yeah, that was our particular case. But and you know, a lot of, like I said, we always supported local musicians, and you know, previously they'd always been overlooked, and now obviously since the pandemic, you know, they're getting a bit of more of a look in, which is a good thing. And that also vindicated a little bit, you know, our approach. And I totally agree with Fatima, you know, quality is everything. And it's super important because, you know, otherwise people can write you off as a bit of a community event. But if you have the quality there, you know, you can become a massive event. So and then that gives more reach and, you know, more opportunities for the artists that you involve.
Thank you. Julie, I think you were maybe going to come in.
Yeah, I was just going to come in and say that there was a few of our festivals went online, had to go online, and it did allow us to reach new audiences. And so it wasn't necessarily that inclusive agenda, but we did have feedback from people who weren't comfortable in coming yet in person. But it did mean that it was difficult to engage others. So I think a few of the events that we work with are absolutely trying to get back in person, but may maintain a component, because there are some people still that would prefer not to be in person.
Yeah. We've got a couple of questions, hands up, so I'll maybe go to those. You know, Kenneth Killeen, you have your hand up. You maybe want to ask a question, and then I'll come to Blethen.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to make a quick comment on the sort of the whole very contentious hybridization model. You know, I mean, because the bottom line is we're all sick to death of you know, trying to replace what is essentially, being in a room with music and people and community, which, nothing will replace that. However, I think it's important to kind of look at hybridization both from an inclusivity perspective and from a different audience mapping perspective as well, because, a lot of what, a lot of people were very creative in using digital models and digital technologies, but a lot of people also just sort of mapped, the analog experience of a live gig to a digital medium, and really that just doesn't really use the digital platforms to the best of their potential, to the best of their ability. There's quite a lot of space in in VR and things like that, where you can create something that could only live in a virtual space, that could not be done. And also there's the issue of time when it comes to hybridization, because you can have events that can be self-guided, that could happen at any other time of the year. So if somebody was in the locality, and they wanted a sort of a guided experience of a festival, some music, so it's not real time, but it's a form of hybridization, which I think is interesting as an engagement model. It could be interesting for people with vision impairments, etc. And I think that, the bottom line about sort of, it's a buzzword now, but the bottom line is that, technology, is just becoming more ubiquitous. And there are a certain cohort of younger audiences that I know that for our festival, I'm the director of Hotter Than July in Dublin, and I know that our festival, we want to appeal as much to families, but we want to appeal to the younger people who just might feel a sense of disengagement with, what they might perceive to be just, aims that are too lofty, or they just might miss the point or feel it's not for them. And I think that that's a kind of an intersect point, to speak to them in a language that they can understand. So I would just say that there is a place for it, and there could be other potentials in terms of a non-linear timeline, or using the technology in a completely new way.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really useful contribution, Ken. Thank you very much for that. I think it might maybe something we can feed into the next session, where there's going to be breakouts and you can feed into similar questions that we've been addressing. I'm going to maybe quickly come to Blethen and then Fatima just to finish up. We've got about 5 minutes and we're going to move into groups. Don't worry, there will be more opportunity when we move into groups to continue to actually address these specific questions, but from your perspective. So if we don't get through them in the next few minutes, you will have the opportunity, honestly. So Blethen, you had your hand up, and then I'll come to Fatima.
Yes.
Oh, the sound's not very good, Blethen.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's a bit better.
I'll just turn off the camera and see if it's better. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I just going to mention the hybridization of festivals as well, because with Open House Dublin, it was always in person. It was always really important to physically experience the buildings and spaces and meet people. It was just very much a challenge was the hybrid event, or the party going online, and very challenging. But I think what it did crucially was it maintained a connection in time of disconnection, so it kept it going. It kept, it was the connection. It was an important connection at that time, something we had to do. So I mentioned as well earlier, the Open House Worldwide Network became something more connected during the time of lockdown, and because it was online and hybrid, some events were happening in some cities in person, but the main Open House Worldwide happened online, and it was a 48-hour virtual festival. But I mentioned about the Young Youth Manifesto, so young people becoming involved, and it gave them a real sense of connection. So I ran that, and it involved a series of workshops on Zoom with some informal kind of Zoom campfire type sessions for the group to connect, and then some other events like workshops, research, and the actual event, the young people, a group of 15 to 18-year-olds spoke for 5 minutes each on a global platform. So connection was really important to them, in that connection. I found as well that it generated audiences overall in the Architecture Foundation. So, and
I'm sorry, Blethen, but the sound's really bad. We're probably going to have to mute it. I'll come back to you if we can get that sorted.
I'm sorry. Okay.
If that's okay. We'll maybe just come to Fatima and then Rotendo. Hopefully everything sounds a bit better. I know that's difficult to hear. Fatima.
Yeah, we tried to run 2 festivals which were mainly digital, and they were not success. We struggled. We struggled with audiences for a wide variety of reasons. One of the biggest ones was digital poverty. The idea that people have access to Facebook, to devices is not great in our community. The other issue is people live in very congested housing where we are. The streets and public places are so important. The other thing is that it's not as inclusive as you might think. I mean, the idea, obviously, with digital poverty, people have access to ways to view the festival, is that what festivals do, public festivals do, is they provide a forum for a way of socializing that you don't get in everyday society. And that's something you don't get with hybridization. The idea that, someone in a tweed jacket sitting next to a Roma woman, sitting next to a young black kid to watch a film, you're not going to get that in hybrid. Well, you might, but you'll be virtual and you won't see them. So the way people negotiate space at festivals, their own space, is really, really important. And I mean, I thought we're going to stop hybridization and it was going to be part of the past, but I didn't realize people were still talking about it as something in terms of future programming. But we won't be doing it. What we will be doing is having an access budget. One thing we did realize is that, as some people have said, people can't always be there. So maybe videoing it or providing some sort of digital format as well as the live event could be a possibility for some groups of people who require equal access where they can't be there in form. But I can't see it replacing anything live as far as we're concerned, really, for those reasons.
Yeah, no, that's really useful. Okay, I'm a bit aware of time. We have a session just straight after this where there's breakouts which are going to address similar questions but get more of the audience and others to feed into that process, and that will be the final session. So I think what I'm going to do is bring this session to a close by thanking our 5 contributors for excellent contributions. As always with these things, you could have gone for 2, maybe 2.5 to 3 hours. But as I said, the next session will allow us to follow these up, and hopefully those who have spoken, Julie, Philip, Amaranta, Lethan and Fatima, are able to continue in one of those breakout groups and contribute to that. We're going to use a Jamboard. We're going to use this kind of online space where people can actually populate with some of the written words. They're all going to be moderated. So what's going to happen next is if you just sit where you are, I think, we're going to put you into breakout groups, so you will essentially leave the space. Teresa's maybe going to give us that piece of information. You'll leave the space and into another group, and there will be a moderator. So you can talk, and the moderator will write. So the moderator will just note down the points that you make, and then Bernadette will be across the various groups, and we'll pull some thoughts together at the end of the session, which will be about 4 o'clock. And then there's a graphic illustrator has been noting down ideas, which we'll be sharing with you as well before we come to a close. So thanks everyone for that session. Hand over to you, Teresa.